What do Bridgerton, Star Wars, the term goblin mode, and the Barbie movie all have in common? That's right, the discourse, the constant online discourse. They're also all episode topics from my new favorite show, Material Girls, a pop culture podcast that uses critical theory to understand the zeitgeist. If you like culture study, you have to check out this bi-weekly show hosted by two queer Canadian academics who love to get to the bottom of why certain things become popular and what that popularity tells us about society. Each episode, they tackle a piece of pop culture, whether that's a book or a movie, a meme or a song, and ask why this and why now. And guess what? I was on a recent episode all about athleisure. And let me tell you, these hosts, they do their research. We talked about post-World War II manufacturing, second wave feminism, the neoliberal collapse of work and leisure, the rise of Chip Wilson's Lululemon empire, and so much more. Be sure to check out Material Girls wherever you get your podcasts, or head to materialgirlspod.com to learn more. That's materialgirlspod.com. Okay, I am so excited for this episode, and Melody has a song queued up that she's going to play for you, Leah, and then you're going to explain this song and what it means to someone who has no context for it.
Okay, this is great. This is a good challenge.
I saw a man with a tack on his big fat belly. It wiggled around like marmalade jelly. It took me a while to catch what he said, 'cause I had to match a rhythm of his belly with my head. Jesus saves is what he waved in a typical tattoo green. He stood on a box in the middle of the city and he claimed he had a brain. What do people think when they hear that I'm a Jesus freak?
That's
I like
great.
that we're not that worried about them suing us. We're like, dcTalk's not going to sue us.
Oh, yeah, no.
Okay, so Leah, can you tell us what that rap is?
First off, I have to say I wish this podcast came with visuals, because I was having a really good time watching Melody rock out to it, because she knows the whole all of the lyrics.
She made me watch the video yesterday, which I hadn't seen in quite a long time. So yes. Who is this?
In my book, I write about this as the peak of contemporary Christian music, the number one youth group band, a group called dcTalk. And this is, I would say, their most culturally influential album. Yeah. It is called Jesus Freak. That single, it sounds a lot like Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. In fact, if you play them on top of each other, you can find that on YouTube. They're very, very similar, but it came out a few years later. That's what I think makes it like the ultimate of contemporary Christian music. If you want to understand this thing called CCM, I can't imagine a better starting point than that particular song. Do you remember that song?
Oh my gosh. Like that whole album brings me back to like a winter youth retreat for like ninth graders at like an old camp, right? Then it's like all the ninth graders from all the Presbyterian churches in the inland Northwest. And you're like, this is so cool, because you're going to meet all these other ninth graders. And then that's just playing like as you come in. You're like, wow, cool. And then there's a talk about like how you shouldn't masturbate or something like that.
You pretty much got it.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Leah Payne, and I'm author of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, a history of contemporary Christian music.
So we're going to talk so much about like the music, like what actually makes the music, the ideology, all those things. Mm-hmm. But I want to acknowledge at the very beginning that we are three people, and I'm including Melody here, who grew up around Christian music and know a fair amount about it. And we want to be careful, because we have a really broad audience, not to make this episode too inside-y baseball. Like we want to speak to people who like absolutely knew what that song was, but then also speak to people who are like, what in the world is this? And so I think what I want to start with is underlining, even if you know nothing about the history of Christian rock, why is it important for us to kind of recover this history and think about it in this context?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why I think it's important to understand. One reason, probably the chief reason that I think somebody who doesn't know much about contemporary Christian music might want to know about it, is that if you look at the music of this kind of nebulous group that people label evangelicals. It's actually a mashup of a lot of different groups. But if you look at the music of that group, you see the emergence of a group of people who were really trying to shape American public life. So if you want to know why a lot of the energy behind conservative, particularly conservative white evangelical activists, a lot of times the music was the leading indicator of how people were thinking about what they should do. So, you talked about the youth group talk. Yeah. There were a lot of youth group talks, and music was a really important part of how evangelicals were trying to raise their children and the types of political and theological values that they wanted them to have. And we see that, like, for example, contemporary Christian music artists were at the vanguard of efforts to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Right.
And so if you look at the music, you see a lot of their activism. They were also really into wanting to shape how sex ed was done in public schools. If you look at the music, there are lots of songs, as you mentioned, a lot of songs about sex and sexuality. So some of the things that you might not see if you look at how, like, public statements from denominations or like official documents, you see in these unofficial ways, the things that are happening in youth group end up actually shaping how we think about our shared life together in this country.
I love this. And I think, what it brings to mind, two things. One is that music can function as a form of propaganda.
Certainly.
And I think that we know that. But then sometimes when we get focused on like, oh, this is just artistry, or like, or, oh, this is beautiful, like a hymn is beautiful, or more classical music, like we forget the ways in which it has been wielded historically. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about your book, is it doesn't start in 1995 with the beginning of the release of Jesus Freak. Like this is like Jesus Freak emerges halfway through the book. And I think there's an interesting way that we can talk about the power of these songs in terms of like emotional persuasion, the way that they functioned as part of conversion narratives, right? Like they singing and listening to music was very much part of the overall project of converting people, right? Getting people to this emotional space where they felt like they wanted to convert. And then also think too about how like the creation of an entire industry was part and parcel of this larger project on the part of white evangelicals to create an alternative cultural sphere, like inclusive culture, not inclusive as in welcoming all people, but a place where like if you were growing up in one of these households, you could get movies and music and books that all function within this universe that was, as was called at the time and still, non-secular, right?
Right.
Like we don't listen to secular music in this house. And this was always like a huge thing at the camp that I went to, is that you weren't allowed to play secular music on the boombox, and what was considered secular and what wasn't. Like,
was that up for debate?
Oh, yeah, because this was also when I was a counselor in particular. So the early 2000s, it was like, is Creed secular?
Oh, right? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, or can you read these lyrics into it? Is U2's 40? Like, can we listen to U2?
Right.
If there is a song that is based on a Bible verse and that we also sing like another song about, like around the campfire. So all of these questions, though, I think, understanding that this was part of this larger project that we can see now in the movement to like create charter schools and make it legal to homeschool in whichever way you want across the nation, like building a world that is apart from the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I think that's something that a lot of people who grew up in it felt, but wouldn't necessarily think to articulate, in part because it's just, it's like the air you breathe.
Right.
And until they sort of bumped up against some of the boundaries of it for many different reasons, because it was a fairly strictly managed community, like the boundaries around it. And I think one of the most interesting things to me about it is that it's a separate sphere, but with similar consumption patterns.
Yes.
So it's like the idea is not to stop being an American consumer, but to express through your consumption the ideal, citizen according to these evangelical values. And I think that's the thing that makes it kind of puzzling to people on the outside.
Right.
Right. But, the idea that you're going to show your devotion through what you buy, I think is at the heart of it. And so it's like, you buy this book, you buy this particular album. And one of the fun things just the interesting things, one of the quirky things about the music is that the core customer of this music was actually not teens. Those are the people the industry people wanted to be listening to it, but it was the moms of the teens.
That's so funny.
The core customer. So it's like it's a world created and maintained, and a lot of times very strictly enforced by a particular set of moms. Which
right.
I so
this is funny to me because my mom, I think, really disliked all Christian music, even though she was like a leader in the youth group and stuff. And that's because she loved all other sorts of music. And we can get into some of the like conversations about whether Christian music is good later.
Yes.
But I think that she always was like, are you sure you want to listen to this?
That is funny.
But the whole idea, and this seems so different from the rest of like music production, is that you had these people saying, we are worried, like our teens are vulnerable to the secular world. So in order to protect against them, let's like create music that is ostensibly for them. Like let's like create a bubble around them almost.
Yeah, you can really tell that these ideas gained traction before the internet. Because
so
now,
true.
Yeah, like now you could not do this. It'd just be impossible, because
right.
There's too many ways to sneak things for teenagers. And so one of the earliest versions of trying to save and protect the young that I write about in the book through music is teetotaling songs, like temperance hymns. So from the early 20th century, there's this idea. It corresponds to the rise of celebrity culture and the rise of mass media and the rise of the United States as being like the largest purveyor of that.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see how people think, okay, look at this incredible power, radio and film and, all these things, like what could we do? And for a certain group of people, it seemed like the natural extension of that would be, let's create media that engages young people. And for a long time, they really struggled with music because rock and roll was like a big transgressive problem. They eventually figured it out. By the time you get to Jesus Freak, that's like everything's kicking into high gear. They figured out a really successful strategy for that. But it was a tough nut to crack originally. They had a hard time.
Right. Yeah. Like that's such a funny point that like, because rock and roll was so closely associated with a certain type of lifestyle, like the music itself could not be appropriated for Christian use for many decades. And then something begins to switch in the 90s, right?
So in the 1950s, a lot of the problems that people had with there are two sets of problems that are kind of like overlapping. One is that rock was originally associated with Black culture. So for white Americans generally, that was a problem. And I'm not the first person who said this. Other historians have argued that conversations about rock became kind of like a proxy conversation about civil rights in the United States. But then for both Black and white communities who were Pentecostal, and because a lot of rock and roll came out of Pentecostal communities, they were frustrated by rock because they felt like it was taking the sounds of their church music and putting it into like these terrible things, like singing about things like sex. Like one of the songs, Great Balls of Fire, the phrase Great Balls of Fire was originally a reference to like the Holy Spirit descending like tongues of fire on the practitioner. And it's about speaking in tongues. But then if you know the song, most people do, Great Balls of Fire, it's a very thinly veiled reference to sex. So you can imagine church people, it's not veiled. He's talking about sex. You can imagine church people just being like, what? You took the sound of our worship and then you did this other thing with it. So it was a really, like, there were a lot of reasons why people had a hard time with it. But around the 1970s, there were a group of people all over the country, but a lot of them were on the West Coast, kind of hippie converts to Christianity, people called Jesus people. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with that world, I'm sure you knew about like Keith Green and people like Randy Stonehill and Larry Norman. And those folks created music that people like Billy Graham, another kind of parental figure who wanted to, engage the young with media, he recognized, oh, they've done something here that we could harness for, in their minds, the good of evangelical kids. And so then an industry takes off because there's like a partnership between the people who are making it, the younger people who are making it, and then these media makers who were actually really smart about it.
Hey everyone, it's Anne. We love making this show with you, and we want to keep doing it for a long time. Here are a few ways that you can help us. First, subscribe in your preferred podcast app so that you automatically get every new episode. Second, you can tell a friend about the show. Word of mouth is still the most effective way for people to find new podcasts. And third, you can post your favorite episode and why you love it on your Instagram stories and tag us at Culture Study Pod. And finally, if you can support us financially, you're not just helping us make the show, you're helping out all the listeners who can't swing a subscription right now. If you sign up for a yearly subscription for $50, you're basically paying $1 per episode. What other little treat can you get for $1? And if you already subscribe to the Culture Study newsletter, it's only $30 a year, which comes out to 60 cents an episode. 60 cents! And all those dollars and cents pooled together make this a viable project. No matter which way you're able to support us, we're so grateful. So thank you, and now back to the show.
So we have so many questions. I was delighted by the diversity of questions that we received.
Yay!
And so many of them because often in our little submission form, we ask for recommendations for a co-host. We already knew that you were going to be our co-host, but that's just in the form. And so many people recommended you as the co-host.
Oh my gosh, I'm so honored.
I know, right? So to sort through this history for the last 25, 30 years, we're going to get into the questions. And this first one is from Marta.
What was the machine behind Christian rock and pop in the early 2000s? Where was all that money going? Were the bands actually practicing Christians or devout? Or was this just a way to break into the music scene? Some bands seem to have had legit staying power, bands like Switchfoot or Reliant K. Why? I just want to deep dive into this whole world.
Okay, Marta, we have the book for you.
I love it, Marta. Oh my gosh, this is great.
But let's pick apart her questions.
Okay.
So the first question, and this I find really fascinating. So, what was the industry behind the boom of Christian music in the late 90s, early 2000s? And you were part of this world, so I'm
yeah. That's such a good question, because the answer is that by the late 90s and early 2000s, the Christian music market had done what any growing market does, which is it consolidates and is overtaken by corporate interests. So by the late 90s and early 2000s, the vast majority of music that you would have heard on the radio that you'd classify as contemporary Christian music was owned by non-church related entities, corporate entities. So by that time, the money that you would get from like royalties from hearing something on the radio or album sales, a lot of that went to these massive corporations. And so that, the short answer is that I would say in the late 90s and early 2000s, this is the peak. So there were a lot more artists that were able to make a living then. So I think that the question is getting at, like, by the time you get to that era, it's basically the same people that are making money off of Britney Spears are making money off of these groups. And so there's not really a distinction in terms of where the big money is going. But there were a lot more bands too. So if you liked that world, you had a lot more options, because the kind of the big selling groups could fund some of the less profitable groups. And of course, that's almost all gone now.
So what about the second question about, and maybe we can kind of be meta about this.
Sure.
This question just generally about like, are they actually practicing Christians?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people wonder this just because with celebrity in general, there's a lot of performance of a particular image.
Right.
And faith is a complicated thing. And like a lot of these artists were people in their 20s and 30s and probably on their own faith journeys in so many different ways. So
Right.
how have you thought about this in the course of writing your book and doing this research?
I would say, like, in one sentence, I would say that most of the folks who got into this business did so, to use a bachelor term, for the right reasons. They, I think most of them were personally quite devout. They felt like they wanted to do something for God. I think that's the vast majority. I think the label of Christian and how it was defined in that world was very specific. So
Yes.
I think that there were a lot of people who ended up being labeled as defectors or apostates who they themselves would claim Christian identity, but it's not that really specific version of a really particular kind of conservative Christian. And so there, throughout the history of contemporary Christian music, there were people who would be sort of dissenting voices that might get labeled by people inside it as outsiders. But if you talk to them, they're like, hey, I'm a devout Christian. I'm just not this kind.
Right.
So I think, and then, one of the things about the late 90s and early aughts is that there were some artists and bands who came to see contemporary Christian music as a kind of farm team for the general market.
Yeah.
So sometimes, they would be seen as insincere, and I don't necessarily label them as non-practicing Christians. They had different aspirations. Like they wanted to play stadium rock shows and they didn't want to play churches. So I don't know. Sometimes I think people interpreted that as being hypocritical, but I think in the late 90s and early aughts, there were a lot of examples of that kind of thing working. So some of them, they were performing in youth groups and they'd rather be performing in clubs. And does that make them insincere? I don't know. It's when I think about what I was thinking when I was 19, I had no idea what I was doing. So right. I think, people put a lot of weight on what teenagers were doing. And I guess that's the nature of American pop culture. But I sort of feel empathetic for a lot of them because I'm like, I'm so glad no one was following me around, looking to me as a moral and spiritual exemplar when I was 19.
The closest I had to that was like being a camp counselor. Woo. And like, I'm kind of even weirded out by that memory. I do, and I think we should be explicit that like this world, it was a very tiny box that you could be in terms of like things that could get you excluded from this world or like seen as being bad or apostate, like, all these different things. It's if you were queer, if you cheated on someone, if you had sex before marriage and someone knew about it.
Absolutely.
If you use drugs and alcohol, like, and someone knew about it. And this is the thing, as you point out, lots of Christians drink. Lots of Christians have sex before marriage. Like there are, but this was the interpretation within this particular like white evangelical, very conservative world was that those things were not good role models, right? Like that you were not being a good like Christian role model. And so that was not allowed.
Yeah, that's one thing that I thought was so interesting. One thing I found that I wasn't expecting to find was that there are actually a really small group of people who created contemporary Christian music, and the vast majority come from 3 different groups. But one of them is a group called the Holiness Movement, which is a really radical movement that got going in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. But these people practice this idea that you want to demonstrate the power of God in your life through really radical external things. So you don't drink, you don't dance, you don't gamble, you wear very modest clothing. For a lot of women in those communities, no makeup, don't cut your hair, no jewelry. So that movement created a lot of the music. And so a lot of the people in contemporary Christian music were like the grandkids of those people. So you can kind of see like that's a really specific way of being Christian that, like
Yeah.
you said, like this is so anecdotal, and I wish I had better statistics on this, but I've talked to so many people who were like, I grew up Presbyterian or I grew up Methodist, and their parents were kind of freaked out when they started getting involved in the CCM world, because it was like this kind of holiness culture that the parents were like, where are you getting this?
I think that absolutely happened, and also was a symptom of that moment in the 90s and 2000s where a lot of what are called mainline Protestant churches, so things like Presbyterian churches, I don't know of any Episcopals who got into CCM, but maybe that happened. Like Method, just like that there was this evangelical turn, and it was especially happening in the youth groups and in the youth movements. The other thing, so two things. One, I went to, maybe you went to this too. I went to a Christian rock festival called Creation at the Gorge.
Oh, gosh.
Which is like the premier festival site in the Pacific Northwest. And my mom let me go because it was a Christian rock thing. And we went with boys. We didn't have any parents. It was amazing.
Did you have
I
the
got
best
so
time?
sunburnt. I was so, in hindsight, I'm so mad because I didn't go see Lilith Fair, but I did go see Creation. But I have an incredibly, incredibly vivid memory. So this is in Central Washington in July. It's like 90, 95 out. And a bunch of people, including me and my friends, had our bikini tops on because it was so hot.
You
And
daring
from
women.
the loudspeaker, the announcer said, we need the women, the godly women in attendance, to be mindful of tempting their Christian brothers.
Oh, wow.
And basically put on some clothes, right? And like that, I just, from the loudspeaker.
Were you, like, what was that like for you as a teen? That would be so embarrassing, I would imagine.
Well, it was so, like, this is kind of the reconciliation process that I think a lot of people listening to this music or a part of this culture were going through, is that, I didn't go to private Christian high school. Like, I didn't drink or do drugs when I was in high school, but I like made out with guys and had impure thoughts and wore bikini tops, right? Like, and so
You Jezebel.
the every day of trying to manage this messaging that was coming from both the music, but also from other authority figures in my life, with like, how do I personally feel about this, was what eventually led to my own, what's often called deconstruction of one's faith. That's a term that's become popular recently, and moving away from the church in general. So I know that there are some artists, and this is part of the question, there are some artists who have publicly deconstructed or moved away from the faith. I'm thinking of Jennifer Knapp, who was actually playing at Creation and who I loved.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Came out as gay. And how are there more that I don't know about?
Yes, and I have to say that Jennifer Knapp was a source for this book. And so my parents didn't, my dad really didn't like contemporary Christian music. So it sounds a little bit like your mom. He thought it wasn't good music. And so it irritated him. So he didn't have it in our house, which is so funny. Yeah. So of course I was raised around that world. It was like, just like the air you breathe. So it's not that I wasn't familiar with it. It's just, it didn't have like the same home life that for a lot of people who are raised in it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think maybe I just didn't take it quite as to heart like you would if it were. But Jennifer Knapp, I remember because I saw her in college and I remember thinking, wow, that was great. Like she was great. And she is great.
We should tell listeners that her sound was very much in tune. Like she could have played at Lilith Fair. Like it was her and a guitar and like beautiful, soulful songs that were very confessional to me. Like they felt very much in touch with like how I was feeling as a teen. So.
Yes, and she was on Lilith Fair. She played Lilith Fair. Yeah. So you're totally right. She was and is excellent.
Yeah.
And I think one of the sticking points for how people interpreted her when she came out, the big issue was that she would not renounce her Christianity. She's like, I am a Christian. And so that was a really interesting, like then all of a sudden that kind of puts her outside the folds. But if you ask her, she'll tell you that. But yes, there were lots of people who end up getting sidelined. Some of them go quietly. Some of them made noise. One of my favorite stories in here is from a woman who was really popular in the 80s. Her name was Leslie Phillips, and Leslie Phillips found the world to be very suffocating. And in interviews, she has talked about how people like A&R people would tell her, you sound too sexy. And she's a great singer, by the way. And so she'd be like, well, what am I doing? That's, it's just my voice. What should I do? And they'd be like, didn't really have an answer, but knock it off. So at one point she basically tells them, because they're, the contemporary Christian music labels oftentimes had morality clauses. And there are other, that's not that unfamiliar to a lot of musical, like secular or non-CCM albums.
It's a classic. In classic Hollywood, it was a thing. Exactly. There's still some version in a lot of stars clauses.
Right. So that's not that unusual, but it was a fairly specific version of it. And she essentially told her label, listen, I've had sex outside of marriage. I don't mind if people know about it. And then they let her out of her contract, according to her. But, the interesting thing about her, I just have to say, she changed her name to Sam Phillips, and she did the Gilmore Girls music. She's excellent. So look her up. That's just a fun Easter egg for people. That part didn't end up in the book, but I feel like your listeners would be like
100%.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So things turned out okay for her.
This is a great segue into our next question, which is about the sound of the music itself. And this comes from Sarah.
I have a longstanding theory that Christian rock has an identifiable sound beyond its lyrical content. In other words, I am convinced that I can identify the genre just flipping through radio stations. Is there a musical production style or something else at play here? Am I delusional? A bit of context, I was a self-proclaimed Jesus freak in my teens, so I was heavily into Switchfoot and dcTalk and the like until I left the church around 2004.
Okay, I agree with Sarah. There is a sound. I know like if I'm flipping through the radio stations, 100% I know what it is. And then the other thing that I will say is that there is a sound of what I think of as like the very right now Christian music, which is music that plays at all of Chip and Joanna Gaines's properties in Texas. And it sounds like the Lumineers, and it doesn't explicitly reference Jesus, but I know what's going on. I just know. And also at any of the Christian or church-owned coffee shops, like cool coffee shops that don't announce that they're Christian or church-owned, but
Yes.
And part of it is the demeanor of the baristas.
Yes.
I always know. What are your thoughts about this particular sound?
Oh, gosh. So many. I'm having like 50 all at once. But yes. Yes to the question. I think some of the sound comes from, as CCM grew as an industry, it found itself in Nashville, Tennessee. And there's an actual Nashville sound that is very polished, as a certain type of songwriting, certain types of harmonies. And I would say that a lot of people who know how to identify contemporary Christian music have had, at one point in time, a flash of a thought, is this country or is this Christian? So country music and contemporary Christian music, they're both located in Nashville. So they one reason is they use a lot of the same session players. It's a lot of the same people who are creating it. So that's part of the sound. But also, I think contemporary Christian music was really tailored, especially in that era, to white suburban life.
Yes.
So it's
and moms, right? It has to be palatable to moms.
It has to be moms. Moms have to want to listen to that stuff in the car. Now, when I'm with my children in the car, I have young children, and I listen to the music I like. So my children listen to Foo Fighters. But that's because I'm a woman of my, of a certain age. But but what I'm saying is I control the music. And so it had to be music that conservative Christian moms living in the suburbs would want to play. In fact, there are some funny stories about some of the edgier bands, like bands that were on labels like Tooth and Nail, that had a very different aesthetic, not the Nashville sound, and moms didn't like it. So sometimes kids got away with listening to kind of subversive messages from Christian punk and ska and metal, mostly because their moms didn't like it. So a lot of it's like the mom sound is what you're hearing.
Was POD one of those? Is that am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, they were such an interesting band, and I talk about them as sort of the end of that era because they had a mainstream record deal. They didn't come up, when you were talking about being at a Christian camp, a lot of the sites for Christian music festivals were the same sites that 100 years earlier, those kids' grandparents had been having like tent revival meetings.
Yep.
And POD they are not from those networks. So they came up from Southern California. They're not like white evangelical youth group kids, although they're quite evangelical, but they just didn't come up from that network, and they had a mainstream label. And so they sort of proved that you could be super duper Jesus-y, but not be in that particular world. So it's kind of the beginning of the end of that, I think.
I think there's also something to be said for Christian music also sounding like sometimes like the B- version of a particular genre. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Of course, yeah.
So there's this band, Third Day, that I just loved Third Day so much. And they sound, I don't know, like they sound like watered down Lifehouse, which is kind of one of those crossover, maybe it's Christian bands, which sounds like watered down Creed, which sounds like watered down Pearl Jam, right?
Oh, yes.
So it's like all of this sort of derivativeness all the way down. Yeah, do you know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a very there's no doubt about that. And I think, one of the things that's so interesting to me about that is I would say that for the most part, that was by design. And the reason why, it's not that people wanted to make less good versions of it, but the whole industry, because it was created, one of the first big executives in contemporary Christian music, a guy named Billy Ray Hearn, was a Southern Baptist youth pastor before he became a record label executive. So he is the kind of guy who wants to keep Southern Baptist kids Southern Baptist. And they were worried about like what rock and roll and other kinds of music were doing to the young. And so what they did was they looked to the general market and then looked for positive and encouraging alternatives to the general market. So it's by design, it lags. And that was a really, there were people who were very frustrated by that. People, I talk about a couple of them, a guy named Steve Taylor and a guy named Charlie Peacock, and I used to work for Charlie Peacock, who were very frustrated by that model and basically said the philosophy that is upholding this is not going to get us anywhere. We need to just create good art, and people will be attracted to whatever message we say if we create good art. Steve Taylor signed a band called Sixpence None the Richer. And they had a mainstream trajectory. Charlie Peacock signed Switchfoot, and another artist named Sarah Mason, who had, they were the kinds of bands that you would hear in the background of WB shows, like teen romance. That's like mainstream music. But I think for a lot of the bands, they were constantly frustrated. And that's why it ended up not being sustainable, because once you get to be a certain age as a teenager, you can figure that stuff out, for yourself. Like when you're 11 or 12, it might not work. But by the time you get to 16, you're kind of like, wait a minute, I could just listen to Pearl Jam. Like if I really like this, I put a story in the book about CCM marketers would create these charts where they would, and it was for youth pastors and moms and some kids, where it'd say like, if you like this band, you should listen to this band. So it's like, if you like Pearl Jam, you should listen to Third Day or something like that. Yeah. And a lot of them are kind of absurd. The comparisons don't make sense. But one of the funniest quotes that I came across in my research was from this young woman who was like, I was told if I liked the Beastie Boys that I would like Audio Adrenaline, which those two groups sound nothing. And then she said, and that's how I found out I love the Beastie Boys. So it's like they kind of reverse engineer. So it's like once you get to a certain age, it doesn't work anymore.
Oh my God. First of all, laughing so hard at if you like the Beastie Boys, you would like Audio Adrenaline. So there's a question that I'm going to paraphrase here because it kind of, it's a good way to continue this. And it's from this listener named Joanne. And she was talking about how in the early 2000s, she saw in her experience a lot of youth group leaders and people in the church looking to mainstream music like Lifehouse, which I mentioned earlier, Switchfoot, like she mentions the fact that Switchfoot was definitely on the Walk to Remember soundtrack, which yes, I remember.
Yes.
But she thinks that there's something interesting going on, like post 9/11, that made people search for religious meaning in mainstream music. But I'm also interested in like these bands who maybe saw that they could have it both ways, or maybe that this was also a classic proselytizing component, right? Where you're like, oh, well, if we hook people outside of Christian music with these songs, then maybe they'll come to Jesus through listening, like as a gateway to the rest of the music and the rest of, I don't know, faith. So what are your thoughts here?
That's a great, I think, first off, I definitely think there's something to the 9/11 connection. I do think that was a time, I mean, I remember it quite well. And if you were anywhere near adulthood, it's changed all of our lives forever. But I think the best example of that I would point to would be when Creed played the Super Bowl in 2001. And there are some fascinating videos of that where they were doing "Won't You Take Me Higher," and people were very distraught in that time. So it would have been like September 11th. And then I think that those types of groups really did strike a chord when people were really searching for meaning. I think it was a Super Bowl. It might not have been the Super Bowl, but I'll have to check.
Yeah, I think it was at a Thanksgiving football game halftime show. There's like many games on Thanksgiving after 9/11.
Okay. And looking back on it, you can see like, oh, people were really into like making, meaning out of that time. But I think the era where there were these bands, I think a lot of that has to do with the arc of the industry itself. So as corporate interests got more involved in contemporary Christian music, it actually allowed bands that had crossover capacity to try to get out there. Like they had other distribution networks. So a band that could have mass appeal, the larger non-religious record labels, they don't care. Like they just want stuff to sell, So right. They're not going to stop anybody from connecting with mainstream audiences. A lot of bands felt that they were stymied in some ways by the Christian marketers because they branded. Once you get branded as contemporary Christian, it's like the least cool thing ever. So once you, that can be that was really frustrating. In fact, there are instances I point out where bands get so frustrated. A lot of them, or some of them, ended up even trying like legal action, like stop marketing us this way. We want to be a regular band, but it's hard. It's sort of the kiss of death because contemporary Christian music had within its branding such a parental thing. I mean, I think all of us know that the worst thing that you can be is mom and dad music to a 15-year-old.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's super interesting, right? That they couldn't get away from it. So the best move would be to try to like not start with that label in the first place.
Right.
And I think you're totally right. Just I'm thinking about like all of the culture that was popular in the post 9/11 world was they were using forms of melodrama to try to make meaning and also try to make the world morally legible in some way, right? So like stuff that was very, very low, very, very high, like stuff that allowed you to feel emotions in some way, whether that was anger or glory or, whatever things. Like I think we latched onto them.
Yeah.
And so some of those things too within, saying like this is about God.
Absolutely.
Which I don't know. Do you think do you think Higher is about God?
I think it's got to be some kind of spiritual something. Just knowing about the lead singer, grew up in Pentecostal circles. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's a funny era because there are groups like Evanescence, for example, that had a similarly epic sound with a female lead vocalist, which is kind of unusual for rock bands. But anyway, there was always tension with those groups, especially, and when you think about them as very young people, they're trying to like find a place in an industry, and there are lots of other mechanisms that people want to capitalize on these groups in a lot of different ways. So there's like there's the youth group world, like youth pastors are always looking for new material to keep the kids in youth group, keep them engaged. Moms are trying to make sure their kids don't listen to sex and swearing and drugs and on mainstream. and then the kids themselves, for many kids, in the late 20th century in the United States, music is a way to express yourself and to distinguish yourself from your parents. So they're looking to, you know, subvert a lot of that stuff. So there are a lot of different motivations going into like how these groups are received. And for those groups, I did want to say about 9/11, there were a lot of like non-crossover bands and artists that used that opportunity to stoke patriotism in evangelical circles. So I would say that on the flip side, the groups that had no mainstream appeal, that were only kind of internal, it was very useful for George W. Bush and his administration. In fact, Michael W. Smith, a huge in contemporary Christian music world, if you don't know who he is, he performed at the Republican National Convention in support of George W. Bush and wrote a song all about 9/11. So 9/11 in the internal, like the subculture world, was huge. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and that's where you get into some of like the white Christian nationalism that a lot of other scholars are working on right now, in terms of like, there's all this paraphernalia around, like, I did an interview with Kristen Koves-Dumais about white nationalism, and Jesus and John Wayne is the name of her book, which is so good. And she talks a lot about how evangelical Christianity even like is co-opting like William Wallace from Braveheart during this time, right? So there's a lot of other co-opting that is going around that is part of this larger white nationalist project as well. Okay, we have a question next from Christine, and Melody's going to read it.
Christian rock, I loved it. Why was it so quirky, and whose fault is it that everyone switched to worship songs?
Okay. So Melody brought up the example of a Newsboys song that is called Breakfast. And the chorus is as follows. When the toast is burned and all the milk is turned and Captain Crunch is waving farewell, when the big one finds you, may this song remind you that they don't serve breakfast in hell. This just reminds me like how sometimes, like you said, like there's a little bit of a farm team for the rest of the music industry. Like a lot of these songs are like, oh, this is the song that my friend and I made and then we practiced in our garage. Like I just think you got more of that stuff that made it onto the album than in some other forms. So that's my explanation for the quirky. If you have one to quickly before we can get into the worship music, I would love to hear.
Oh, yeah. Well, Steve Taylor is somebody who you can thank for the quirk of that particular song. But I think some of the quirkiness had to do with, I mean, you know, the 90s did have a lot of sort of quirky bands just generally.
Yes.
So I think some of
Fair.
that has to do with, there was sort of a, I don't know, kind of a silly quality to some rock music. So I think this is what's funny to me about that particular song is that it's talking about actually something kind of serious if you're in those circles, which is hell. It's talking about
no
breakfast.
Captain Crunch in hell.
Yeah, like if that's not going to inspire holy living, I don't know what will. But so
just making like the silly stuff part of the conversation too. Like I can see my brother like really liking that song.
Totally,
Not
it was
anymore,
huge.
but when he was like 10. And then the worship song. I didn't even think about this until I read this question. I was like, oh my gosh, right around 2001, 2002, when I was a camp counselor, suddenly all of the new CDs that we were selling at camp were all of the like live worship things, right? And there was, in some ways it was brilliant, right? Because the songs that you were singing during worship were also the songs that were available for these CDs, but it felt like it cannibalized this entire quirky industry.
Yeah.
So what happened there?
Oh gosh. Okay, I'm going to try and do it. I go into it in some detail in the book, but I'll try and give like the shortest version of that. And one, I think, has to do with how people worship now. So Americans worship less often in larger congregations statistically, especially evangelicals, because evangelicals dominate the megachurch scene. So one thing that really damaged CCM was losing medium-sized churches, because medium-sized churches were a part of like a development network. So if you were a band, you'd play small churches and coffee shops first and maybe youth groups, and then you move up to medium-sized churches. And then the aim is to get into those mega churches because that's where you could connect with more fans and actually sell merchandise and stuff like that. So the medium-sized church disappearing, which they are disappearing really quickly, it's a hole in the development network, so you can't get a band to go. The other thing about mega churches is they have incredible resources. Like if you If you look at kind of the it churches right now, not Maverick City, they're not a church, but Elevation Church. But if you look at Maverick City's music videos, which are very like set in a churchy kind of, they can go toe to toe with almost any mainstream like production, musicality.
Yep.
They're killing it. So like they don't need an external band to come and give them a show.
Right.
They're creating like really compelling stadium rock concerts as worship. So some of that is just that. A lot of it also has to do with I think the internet is mainly responsible because young people could very easily get around their parents and could find music that they wanted to listen to that wasn't necessarily mainstream, but also the artists themselves, it came to feel less attractive to try to like make it in that industry. If you're a band like Switchfoot, they had mainstream success. Like there are a lot of other reasons, and some of it has to do with like the fragmenting of evangelicalism just generally. Like there are because there are artists who are connecting with people, just period. But they don't need those networks to do it. They can develop an audience through Spotify or YouTube or TikTok, and they don't need the kind of structure that was contemporary Christian music. So one way of looking at it is that worship music is sort of what's left of the business.
It's like the in-house powerhouse, right?
Yeah. It's like it starts in churches. It kind of goes out into mainstream. It ends up kind of back under the purview of churches. And then another way of looking at it is that worship music is also transnational. So a lot of contemporary Christian music, if you look at the moral imperatives, a lot of it's domestic. They're like, this is the kind of country we want. These are the kind of citizens we want. And worship music, and it can be used for a variety of political causes. I talk about a few there. So it can be politicized. It is politicized, but it's also not exclusively American. There are people who are like trading songs all over the world: Australia, Brazil, Guatemala, Singapore, like it's going all over the place. And so in our global economic world, it sort of makes sense that that's the industry that survives. I don't know if that's probably too much, but that's what I got.
No. I could honestly talk about this for another hour. But for now, paid subscribers, you get to stick around for advice time. Leah's going to help me answer a question about telling people that your faith has changed.
Oh, gosh.
I know. I cannot tell you what a pleasure this has been. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I am just really honored.
Thank you.
The book is so good. And I really think people, whatever their relationship is to this music, will find it really fascinating. It's accessible in so many different ways. So if people want to find more of you on the internet, where can they find you?
They can find me at drleahpayne.com, which I only use that because there was another LeahPayne already taken. So DRIH on most social media platforms. And I'd love to connect with people. I love hearing their stories. And I have to tell you that I'm a big fan of your work. And I called my friend Erica, my best friend, who we talk to each other all the time. And I was like, guess who I'm talking to today? So from Erica and I, we love your work. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was so great. And everyone, the book is God Gave Rock and Roll to You. And if you want to buy it at bookshop.org, use promo code CULTURE to get 10% off. Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod, or check the show notes for a link. We currently need your questions about J-Lo, all things J-Lo, Ben Affleck, particularly Ben Affleck and ambition, jeans, all things jeans, food blogs, and weird TikTok trends you want an explainer on. If you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.